What I want to do here in just the next few minutes is I've a number of books. If someone knows George Gilder's work and then they were to see my books, especially the books Money, Greed, and God, Indivisible, Infiltrated, and a recent book, The Human Advantage, you will see George's thinking throughout that. But in some ways, I try to bring what I think are key Gilder lessons down, bring the hay down where the cows are, in other words, to try to make these really accessible for people that are, not studying economics. They're not going to be sort of familiar with it, or if they had one econ class in college, they probably got stuck in macroeconomics and it was not a good experience. And so they don't actually realize that economics is ultimately about human beings. That's why people are interested in economics. It's because it's really usually people's moral concerns. Either they're concerns about poverty, or they're worried that some people have too much wealth and they've taken it from other people, or their impression that economics is about greed or something like that. So that the reality is that when we think about these things, we're not careful to distinguish, say, descriptive truths of economics, those things that we can know about the economic realm and economic reality by studying it carefully, by studying the theories, by studying the sort of history of economic thought, the history of economic reality, and distilling that. What we do is we tend to think about it in terms of our normative concerns. What's right? What ought we to do? What shouldn't we do? What's just? What's equitable? Those kinds of things. And those are both really important questions. And when you're talking about the human being, those things, they exist in tension or unity, because we are both rational beings, as Aristotle said, we're also moral beings. And so these are real concerns and real truths. Problem is, we often mix all of these things up, and especially when it comes to thinking about markets and entrepreneurship in economics. And I found from years of talking about these issues that in many ways, the primary intellectual stumbling block that people have when they're thinking about free enterprise or markets or what we might call capitalism, though that itself is a dangerous word, is this idea that it somehow dignifies or elevates or depends upon vice and greed. And so what I want to do here in just a few minutes is a very focused talk on really making relevant distinctions. And what I want you to come out the other side with is the realization that people like Adam Smith and George Gilder in particular have key insights and ways of shifting this that both, I think, help us understand the economy and entrepreneurship better, but also resolve these moral problems and these moral qualms that I think so many people have simply because they're not thinking carefully and clearly about these details. And so I want to give you just kind of a brief kind of intellectual history of this basic idea, this intersection of selfishness and greed on the one hand, self-interest, and altruism, which just means acting for the benefit of the other. Now, most people, I often ask high school and college students, what's their mental image of capitalism? And I don't define the word ahead of time. I just say, okay, think about capitalism and capitalists. What comes to mind? And depending upon how old they are, I can say for a lot of people, this is the image or something like this. It's this guy. This is the one certainly that this occupies a bunch of neurons, unfortunately, in my own mind, so that this is the mental picture I have when I hear the word capitalism. It's either the bull on Wall Street or this. Now, this is the character a lot of you will recognize. His name is actually Uncle Pennybags. He is the character from the popular board game Monopoly. What you might not know is this is actually a caricature of the great American financier J.P. Morgan. And you might, if you know what Morgan looks like with the big handlebar mustache and the suit, you might have guessed that. But what's funny about this is this image. I mean, what is he doing exactly? First of all, he's obviously supposed to be part of the upper class. He's dressed here in a white collared suit, what we now would think of as a tuxedo with a top hat. And he has a bag of money. And what's he doing with the money? Well, he's clutching it and he is running away with it. Presumably he's taking it away from someone. And that's the image that people have of this system of capitalism, that it's about these really greedy guys getting a lot of money and hoarding it for themselves and taking it from other people. That turns out that that was actually the lesson that the inventor of the Monopoly game, there was a precursor to the game, was actually invented by a socialist, and she was hoping to turn Americans off to the American system of capitalism in the early 20th century. And so she designed the game for that reason. Parker Brothers picked it up. It turns out it's a super popular game, and I don't know that anybody ever actually even notices the lesson that it's all about rent seeking and zero-sum games and things like that. But that's the sort of backstory. The problem is that we often allow mental images to substitute for careful thinking. In fact, Oliver Holmes, who I don't normally quote, but Thomas Sowell often quotes him as saying, think things, not words. In other words, you might have a word like capitalism. In fact, the word capitalism was popularized, incidentally. It wasn't coined exactly, but it was popularized by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the 19th century. And we kind of got stuck with it. And I go back and forth as to whether it's even good to talk about this word. I think people have less trouble if you say free enterprise or something like that. But in any case, when we hear the word, we allow the mental image to replace in our thinking careful thinking about actual systems in the world, right? Like you would see if you look at the Index of Economic Freedom in 2021. We're not talking about mental pictures. We're saying, here's the list of the countries for which we have data, and here are criteria for determining how economically free they are or unfree. And then here's the data that tells you how well off the countries are. And if you look at that, you'll notice inevitably you have countries like the little small city states, usually like Singapore at the top, and inevitably it's North Korea at the bottom. And that in some ways tells you all that you need to know if you're saying, well, if we want an economy where people can create wealth for themselves and alleviate poverty, then we're going to want economies more like those at the top of the Index of Economic Freedom. But we don't do that. That would be a way of looking at this empirically, right? Where we look at the data and the evidence and we compare. We don't generally do that. What we do is we use our mental images and we import our moral intuitions into that. And then that does almost all the thinking for us when we're thinking about economics. And so I want to urge you, if you can learn not to do that, if you can learn to ask the question, okay, what would happen if we do this? Why would it happen? And figure out the answers to those questions before you ask the questions. And now what system ought we to have? You end up in a much better place, because you really can't answer this question, what kind of economic system should we have? Should or ought, those are normative questions, without knowing what happens in those different systems. But we don't do that. And in fact, we just generally tend to think of Uncle Pennybags and people like that. And this is utterly pervasive, of course, in popular culture. There's a really entertaining movie made in 1987. And the main character is this stereotypical Wall Street real estate trader. The character's name is Gordon Gekko. So this is not the most subtle movie in the world, played by Michael Douglas. In fact, here's a cover story from much later. But notice the question there is greed still good on the front of Fortune? Now, this is from 2005. The movie was made way back in 1987. And it's essentially alluding to a speech that the character Gekko gives near the end of the movie. He's in a stockholders meeting in a big auditorium in a hotel somewhere, and he's just irritated with the discussion, and he somehow manages to get a microphone, and he gets up and he gives this speech that has become famous as the so-called greed is good speech. Here's just a little bit of it. He says, greed is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed cuts through and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all its forms has marked the upward surge of mankind. Now, this is a sort of weird moment in the movie, because in another movie, you would think this is the sort of, battle cry at Agincourt with Henry V or something like that, or Churchill, rallying the country of Great Britain. It's supposed to be inspiring, but of course, this isn't an inspiring speech. And so you don't kind of emotionally know what to do with something that sort of climaxes with this. And in fact, Gekko ends up getting arrested and going to prison. And there's a much later movie in the 2000s that's actually the Wall Street 2 that starts with him getting out of prison. And so you think, okay, well, this is unsavory, but of course, this is a caricature, right? I mean, if you know anything about the film, it was produced and written by Oliver Stone, who's a well-known American leftist. He sort of hates everything American. And so he's created this ridiculous caricature of the business person, of the entrepreneur. That's not something that anybody would actually defend. It's a shameless straw man. And of course it is. The problem is there have been people in the 20th century and even before who have made the case for capitalism precisely in terms of greed and selfishness. Now, Ayn Rand is probably the most widely read writer in English that defends so-called capitalism and economic freedom. Rand was an exile or an immigrant from the Soviet Union in the 1920s. She came to the United States, was on the East Coast for a bit, ended up in California, wanted to be a playwright, and wrote a play called The Fountainhead. And then in 1957, she wrote a very large, highly ideological novel called Atlas Shrugged. And Atlas Shrugged is the thing that really made her famous, but she continued to write and publish for decades, started organizations defending so-called capitalism and economic freedom. She was a hardcore anti-communist. She was really hostile to collectivism. She was also a deeply committed atheist. And she wrote things like this book here, which is really a collection of essays called The Virtue of Selfishness. And in fact, she blamed socialism on Christianity. She said, well, socialism is all about altruism and sharing and people helping other people. And you get that idea from Christianity and the Good Samaritan. And that's all bad. And in fact, whenever that's tried, it ends up killing millions of people. What you really want is something like egoism or objectivism, in which the individual is the primary locus of all moral concern, so that your sort of actions and your own well-being, that's really the only thing that you should be concerned about. And she's not saying that's bad, she's saying that's actually good. Here's how she put it in this book, The Virtue of Selfishness. She said, capitalism and altruism are incompatible. They are philosophical opposites that cannot coexist in the same man or in the same society. Now, as it happens, Rand has eccentric definitions of words. And so when you read that, you might not realize what she means by altruism isn't the sort of dictionary definition. What she really means by altruism is acting for the benefit of the other at your own expense. So anytime you do something that helps another person but that harms yourself, that she called altruism. And as a result, she thought, well, you know, market economies where people actually flourish, this doesn't tend to be how people think. They tend to be acting for their own interests, and yet that's a much better system than this, you know, socialism in which everybody's dying and starving and there's no food on the table or in the grocery store. And so this is how she kind of got herself into this kind of thinking. So there's something to be said for her, the kind of background assumptions. Nevertheless, she was notorious for saying things like this. And of course, when she says that selfishness is a virtue, she's knows what she's saying. She's saying that, yeah, the Christian tradition and the Western intellectual and moral tradition, they have these 7 deadly sins, these vices, one of which is greed or selfishness or avarice. And she says, no, it's not a vice, it's actually a virtue. It's something that we ought to endorse, and in fact, it ought to govern all of our action. Well, this is a real problem. I mean, you don't necessarily have to be a Christian. You could just be a sort of normal humanist that thinks that we ought to help people. You're not going to be really excited about this. And in fact, it's only usually high school males under the age of 21 that get really excited about these sorts of things. It doesn't exactly satisfy our deepest moral intuitions as a sort of rallying cry. And it's also, I think, a very, very weak read and on which to fight the socialist intuitions of college students who get there very often because they actually genuinely care about their fellow human beings. They're just deeply confused about economics. And so I think Rand, if you actually look though at sort of her analysis, some of her characters are interesting, but they always have a bit of an unreality to them. And where they work, they're almost always actually creating value, not just for themselves, but for others. And so I don't think Rand, though she happens to be on the right side of the big economic debate, in the 20th century, I think you can be right for a lot of the wrong reasons. And so I don't think she sort of satisfies the real problem. She doesn't answer the question properly. Now, there was someone else that made an argument like this prior to Rand. It's this guy, Bernard Mandeville. So Mandeville lived in the late 1600s, early 1700s. He was actually Dutch by birth, but lived most of his life and career actually in England. His English was apparently so good that the British neighbors couldn't believe that he actually originally hailed from the Netherlands, but he was a satirist and writer, and he wrote a poem in the early 1600s that didn't really go anywhere. Nobody understood it. And so he later embedded that poem in a larger set of poems, this book called The Fable of the Bees. And you can read this, it's not a really long book, and it's essentially a fable, but in The Fable of the Bees, he gives both the fable, which is in verse, And then the commentary where he explains it. Okay, this is what I actually mean. And the basic idea of the Fable of the Bees, he describes this beehives in which the bees are all greedy and avaricious and thinking about themselves and not caring at all about the hive. But they go out and they get nectar and they build honey and they build these waxy hives, and everything works really, really well. But they don't like it because they have moral intuitions and they think this is a disaster. We're all greedy and avaricious. And so they pray to Jove, that is to Zeus or Jupiter, that Jove will make them virtuous, that he'll make them altruistic, we could say. And so they pray enough that Jove finally gets impatient. He says, fine, I'll make you virtuous. And so they all become virtuous. And then they quit going out looking for nectar. They quit, making honey and building hives, and the whole operation falls apart. And then Mandeville says, now the lesson of this is basically what the subtitle of the book is, a private vice, public virtue. As long as they're individually vicious, they're industrious and productive, and they build prosperous hives. But when they're not, when they're virtuous, right, and care about other people, then they're lazy and they don't do what they should. And that's the sort of lesson. He says, now this applies to the British Empire. It's prosperous precisely because greed and vice, right, are at the center of private action. So it's really a defense of private vice. And it was a very, very scandalous book at the time. But you can see how this in some ways is a sort of proto Ayn Rand. Now, a lot of people think, you may not have even heard of Mandeville or read Rand, but a lot of people think that the great Adam Smith, who is in many ways the founder of modern economics, that he made the same argument, but he actually didn't. Smith, for those of you who don't know, he was a Scottish moral philosopher. He wrote two famous books, one called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and then his magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations, he wrote that in 1776. And The Wealth of Nations, he's famous for a couple of things. One, he's often called the apostle of self-interest, or sometimes selfishness, I think incorrectly. And he's also known for this metaphor of the invisible hand, this idea that a market order under certain conditions, people can be acting for various reasons at the low level, maybe even acting avariciously, but it will give rise to social benefits nonetheless. And people will think, if they're looking at it superficially, that Rand is arguing, oh, that's just, or, that's Smith is arguing just like Ayn Rand or Bernard Mandeville did, but that's not actually the case. Smith actually got a really interesting and sophisticated argument. And it's a big book. And so I want to show you what I think he's doing just by two really famous quotes. And he says this kind of thing, the quote I have here, all throughout the book. He actually never has a nice thing to say about a business person. He was kind of a snobby academic, as they still are, but he appreciated the market and what it could do. But so here's this sort of famous quote. I just want to pause on it for a minute. He said, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." Right, so think about that for a minute. So is he saying greed is good, or butchers and brewers and bakers, they ought to be greedy and selfish, and then that will make them better? No, he doesn't say that at all, does he? He's saying something else. He's talking about the fact that, well, we expect them to have regard for their own interest. And that's actually why they provide us with the goods that they give us. It's not from their benevolence in the sense that they're just doing it like you would give somebody a loaf of bread on the street because they're homeless or something like that. That's not actually what's happening with the butcher, the brewer, and the baker. He is saying something here, but it's actually different from either the kind of Randian thing or the Mandevillian thing. And so now here's one other quote about his invisible hand that seems a little more telling till you look at it carefully. And it is one of only two places he actually uses the idea of the invisible hand. It says, "In spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, business people are led by an invisible hand, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of the society." Now, what's he saying here? Is he saying business people ought to be greedy, ought to be selfish, something like that? Or is he saying something different? Yeah, I think he's definitely saying something different. And to understand what Smith's after, you've got to make distinctions between selfishness, self-interest and greed, or selfishness and greed and self-interest. And then this distinction between what people do in private and what the effects of their actions might be. Those are two different things. All right. So here's the kind of key thing that you have to sort of understand, is that self-interest and selfishness are not the same thing. In fact, if you look at Smith, Smith is a very much a moral traditionalist. In fact, Smith is quite insistent that greed is a bad thing. He never encourages greed as if it's something, sort of praiseworthy. He treats it as a vice. And in fact, Smith is aware of Mandeville's book. And he says, now there's someone else that argues differently than me, is Mr. Mandeville, and I find his system wholly pernicious. That's a direct quote, wholly pernicious. So Smith does not think greed is good. He does not think that it ought to be encouraged. He doesn't think that greed is the sort of fruit of innovation or any of those kinds of things. He's saying something else. The first thing he's saying is that if you just sort of analyze empirically how people act, they generally act in a self-interested way. In other words, they act in a way that's beneficial to them. And there's nothing wrong with that. Self-interest, what he basically means by that, it's what we know and have some control over, that stuff in our sort of domain of activity and concern that we know about and are responsible for and can do something about. So my self-interest includes my own well-being. Every time I breathe, every time you breathe, every time you eat food, every time you look both ways before you cross the street or brush your teeth or take your vitamins or study before a test, you're acting in your self-interest. That's not a bad thing. It's just it's the nature of being bodily creatures where we have particular needs. Imagine if it were different. Imagine if we didn't ever breathe on our own, right? Because that's self-interested. You can't do that. Well, none of us would live more than 3 minutes. So that absolutely makes sense. And so Smith's sort of key point about the butcher, the brewer, and the baker is that you don't need the butcher, the brewer, and the baker to have to visualize world peace or be able to know all of the downstream consequences of his action. The butcher might just be thinking, okay, my daughter needs braces, my other daughter's in college, I need to pay the rent and buy food. And so I know how to do butchery. So that's my profession. Now, how do I do that? Well, I need to do it in a way that will serve other people because people don't have to buy from me. And I need to do it in a way that's as good or better than my competitors. And I need to do it at a price that people are willing to pay. I need to be friendly, right? I need to do all these things so that people will buy my meat from me so that I can satisfy the needs, the self-interest that I actually have. That's all Smith is saying. That kind of self-interest is morally neutral. In fact, I would say it's actually necessary that we be able to do that. It's a much better world in which we're generally aware of our own interests and are able to pursue those in ways than if it were otherwise. But notice he's not saying that absolutely everything goes. In fact, he's talking about a very specific system, the sort of system of what he calls the system of natural liberty. This is not the law of the jungle. It's not anarchy where people get to do whatever they want to do. He's thinking, of course, about England at the time he's writing and Scotland in the late 1700s, in which you've got property laws and you've got the rule of law and people can't steal from each other or poison each other, defraud each other. So you have a basic rule of law that establishes the conditions for this system of natural liberty. Doesn't mean that it just happens in nature. It means it's appropriate to our nature as human persons to be able to do this. So the idea is that a market with the rule of law and property rights and economic freedom allows us to channel our legitimate self-interest into outcomes that are beneficial to other people. And that's the kind of natural way in which the system does. Notice that's a totally different argument than saying greed is good. Saying that, well, no, a certain kind of economic system with the right incentives, it will channel our actions into socially beneficial outcomes. In fact, notice that the golden rule itself assumes this idea of self-interest. The golden rule is do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Well, that only makes sense if you are able, assume you have a properly ordered conscience, and then you are able to consult your own well-being, how you ought to be treated, and then to use that as a guide to how you ought to treat other people. That only makes sense if there's a way you ought to be treated. In other words, it only makes sense if you have a legitimate self-interest. Right? It's not the same thing as selfishness. So that's the absolute first thing to realize. But of course, in that second quote, he talks about the natural selfishness and rapacity of what he's really referring to men of commerce, saying, yeah, you often, 2 or 3 these guys get together and they'll start colluding against their customers and a fixing of the prices or things like that. He doesn't say because they're naturally selfish and rapacious or we should want them to be. He says in spite of. In other words, what he's saying is that in its actual fallen world where people often have mixed motives and some people have bad motives, The same system that's able to channel even legitimate self-interest also has a capacity to channel even people's vices, their selfishness and rapacity, into actions that are beneficial to other people. So that you say, again, what should the butcher do even if he's actually greedy? Well, in a system with the rule of law, the best way to succeed even in fulfilling his greed is to provide good meat for people that they're willing to buy at a price they're willing to afford, and to do it better than his competitors, right? So he's having to actually serve his customers. That's Smith's point. And that's a completely different point than this idea that greed is good. In fact, it's perfectly consistent with saying that greed and selfishness are vices, which is exactly what Smith understood. Now, Smith did not go so far as to describe entrepreneurs as altruistic, which is really what George Gilder in his book, Wealth and Poverty, he in some ways very much built on and went beyond Adam Smith's argument for the benefits of markets and self-interest. In distinguishing between the miser and the entrepreneur, because people will often think the stereotype of the J.P. Morgan character on Uncle Pennybags, or of the great medieval characters, Ebenezer Scrooge and misers, they will imagine that as the image for the entrepreneur. But in fact, that's not at all what entrepreneurs actually do. In fact, this is true in the New Testament. Jesus says, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal. That is an admonishment. It's not an admonishment not to go into business or to be an entrepreneur. It's an admonishment not to hoard wealth, right? But that is not at all what the entrepreneur and a successful entrepreneur in a market economy is actually doing. As George says in Wealth and Poverty, he says, the grasping or hoarding rich man is the antithesis of capitalism, not its epitome, more a feudal figure than a bourgeois one. This is the sort of key point, I think, to understand, is that if you actually analyze what the entrepreneur really does, don't think about necessarily trying to mind read what their motives are, but what do entrepreneurs that are successful, what do they actually do in a market economy? They're really the opposite of the miser. The miser hoarding his wealth. This is the famous Daffy Duck Looney Tunes version of A Christmas Carol, right? The miser is concerned about security. He's concerned about hoarding his money, being able to know where it is, counting it. The entrepreneur is all about risk. It's the person that bears the risk in a business enterprise. The certainty for the miser of holding on to his wealth and knowing exactly how much there is, versus the uncertainty of the entrepreneur who casts his bread on the waters and doesn't know where he's going. Instant gratification. If you're highly liquid, right, and all your money's there and you want to spend it, you can do it right away. The entrepreneur is all about delayed gratification, putting his wealth at risk, so he's highly illiquid, and his money isn't there where he can just use it anytime he wants it. The kind of cynicism that you see in the miser, a zero-sum game mentality where he hoards wealth, protects it from other people, versus the faith in, I think George refers to the compensatory logic of the cosmos in Wealth and Poverty, this kind of faith that if you put your wealth at risk in a wise way, in a way that is learned and that is an understanding of the way the world is, that it can return to you, maybe many-fold. And then money as an end. The miser is thinking about actual money, actual gold coins, versus money as a means. For the great entrepreneur, money is the tool that they use. Just as the carpenter might use the hammer or the painter might use the brush and paint, the entrepreneur uses money in order to create value. And in this sense, as you can see, George is able to say, so the entrepreneur, in a sense at least, is altruistic, not merely selfish or even really self-interested alone, but altruistic in the sense that he's acting for the benefit of the other. Now you might say, okay, that's an altruism it's not the same as the self-sacrificial altruism, say, of a Mother Teresa. That's the altruism that Ayn Rand is thinking about, in which you act for the benefit of the other at a severe cost to yourself. That is a real type of altruism. The greater love has no man than this, but that he lay down his life for his friends. That's a type of altruism. It's a self-sacrificial altruism. But the category of altruism is bigger than that. It also includes actions that might be beneficial to you, but that are also beneficial to other people. And that's the kind of altruism that George is talking about. And we might call that commercial altruism. It's the type of altruism of the butcher. You may not know this woman's name, but he knows that he wants to serve her in a way and that he's likely to benefit from doing that. But his actions are other directed, even if his motives are maybe a mix. He really genuinely cares about her, but he also cares about making money so he can pay the rent. That's okay. But I think the category of commercial altruism is actually a really, really good way and a much better way of thinking about the activities of entrepreneurs than the kind of category of the Gordon Gekko or the Ayn Rand. And with that, I will quit. We have just a few minutes for questions. So let me pull up the Q&A here. Anyone with questions, please feel free. Yeah, so somebody says Christianity is voluntary socialism, not forced socialism. Socialists of today love the false virtue of forced socialism. Yeah, I mean, I know what you mean. Christianity, it encourages private sharing and voluntarism, such as the early church in the book of Acts, in which under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, Luke tells us in Acts that church in Jerusalem sold a bunch of their belongings and they shared the goods in common. But there's never a sense that the private property didn't belong to them. There's never a sense that this is the sort of norm for Christians and churches. In fact, they didn't even happen in other churches in the New Testament, like Thessalonica and Corinth. What was happening is that the new Christians at Jerusalem were responding to an emergency situation with all the Jews that had come there after Pentecost. Suddenly became Christians. You have thousands of new Christians at the birth of Christianity. And these people are away from home, they're away from jobs. And so the local people who are there with their possessions and their jobs and their money, they sell temporarily and share among their new fellow believers so that they can help train them. And for all we know, that lasted for 6 weeks or 6 months. I wouldn't call that socialism, though. Socialism has a very distinct word. It means the abolition of private property, state ownership of the means of production. None of that stuff's happening in the book of Acts. And in fact, I don't think there's anything intrinsically about Christianity that would lead you to that. In fact, 2 of the 10 commandments presuppose private property: do not steal and do not covet. And so I think what socialism, I think, really is, if you want to think of it in terms of Christianity, is it's kind of a Christian heresy. It has its own, especially in the Marxian form. There's this kind of original paradise. There's a fall into slavery and feudalism and capitalism, and then socialism. And then you get the kingdom of God. You get the eschaton, which is this communist utopia where the state withers away and everyone has abundance. It's just that it's wrong in almost all its details. It was based on materialism and economic determinism, but you can kind of see how someone raised in a broadly Christian environment, but now a materialist, could construct a system as Marx did. So I think there's a lot of sort of interesting stuff happening there. Yeah, so is all the stuff the community and government does to redistribute wealth a killer for the benefits of market capitalism? Well, I think, yeah, that would be an empirical question. And so what you want to do is say, okay, which things, I think the government, I'm not an anarchist, so I think the government has a really important role to play. It's a limited role in terms of enforcing the rule of law. It's there in the preamble to the Constitution: establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and so forth. Nevertheless, in the 20th century, under the influence of progressivism, there came to be this idea that there is a political solution to every social problem, and that the government is the effective and best agent for solving that problem. And so that's where I think we got the massive means-tested welfare systems. There are actually 80 of them, believe it or not, overlapping and at times conflicting now in the United States. And I think you can make a very strong argument that those have been counterproductive. They haven't actually reduced poverty, and they've created generational cycles of poverty. The problem was not a concern for the poor and for poverty. The problem was that people didn't think carefully about the incentives that those programs created, and say, okay, what's likely to happen if we say incentivize this particular thing? They didn't do that. We just sort of assumed, well, people are poor. If we give them money and take it from someone else and give it to them, it will help. And so I think you really want to sort of answer those questions empirically, but I think you can make a strong case that they were not helpful. So with that, why don't we stop? And sorry, I didn't get to answer all the questions we wanted to.
All right. Jay, I just want to add one little cap to that brilliant exposition of the altruism of enterprise or whatever. And that is, greed actually leads, as by an invisible hand, to an ever-growing welfare state, to socialism. If you're really a greedy person, your best strategy is to ally with government to take things from others and give it to you. This is the whole, this is how real greed functions. You
Mhm.
join with all your pals and you besiege a politician and get special provisions for yourself. Greed
That's
leads
right.
as by an invisible hand to socialism, to an ever-growing
That's right.
welfare state.
And the incentives, as you say, are to curry favor with the regulators and those who sort of control the market rather than the customer. And that's exactly what you find in socialist systems. So.